Hello, this is Jack Tutor of Attention Magazine. Welcome to the Crucial Listening podcast, where I speak to musicians and sound artists about the 3 albums that are most important to them. I'm sorry about my gruff voice. I went to Glastonbury last weekend and sung all of Radiohead's songs for them. So that's why you've got this unpleasant tone coming at your ears right now. I won't keep you long. I know it's not very nice. But my guest this time is Lawrence English, an Australian sound artist who has released a lot of my favourite music generally, but in particular his most recent album, Cruel Optimism, is incredible. It feels like a particularly pertinent album to have on my person right now. There's a real sense of emergency and imminent meltdown, which feels like a very appropriate soundtrack to the current sense of disarray and impending disaster that we face in the UK, as well as in other places globally. It's beautiful as well, which seems strange to say. Terrible and beautiful. But he worked with loads of collaborators, and we start this interview by talking about his experiences making this record. And in fact, those conversations run through our entire interview here. They keep coming back in, his experiences, and that's largely due to the choices that he made in his albums that he picked. There are a few of his recent collaborators included in the list of artists that comprise his most important albums. He's wonderfully articulate, a really fascinating person to just listen to. And so this one was an absolute treat. You can find more information, including links to Lawrence's work and Room 40, as well as links to more information on the albums he picks at attentionmagazine.co.uk/crucial listening. Anyway, on with the show. Lawrence English, welcome to Crucial Listening.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming on. So, as I'm speaking to you, you've only just recently returned from a trip to Tbilisi in Georgia, where you were performing as part of Soul Festival. Is that right?
Yeah. I've just recovered from the jet lag. I can say it's an unusual circumstance that I get jet lag, but I think because it was such a short trip, my body did not acclimatize at one end and then decided to be extra hateful when I got back to this end. So I've suffered, and I deserve that suffering. I mean, it's unfair to expect a human body to travel halfway across the world and then halfway back again and change hemispheres and maintain itself in any kind of order. That's a ridiculous kind of proposition, I think. So I respect my body for being hateful.
I'm speaking to you in advance of doing 2 night shifts next week, actually, and then so flipping my body upside down and then putting it the right way up again. So I will
It will give you a little reminder. Don't mess with me too much. Be gentle.
So I'm going to assume that as part of your performance, most, if not all, of the material you were playing was from Cruel Optimism, your latest record. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. I mean, basically the way that the set structure at the moment, there's sort of several pieces from Cruel Optimism and some from Wilderness of Mirrors, and then there's a couple of joining pieces that are, I guess, extrapolated out of the material that was part of The Peregrine. But really, for me, there's a pretty strong relationship between Wilderness of Mirrors and Cruel Optimism, so they kind of weave together, and particularly live, they kind of have the same physical capacity, I suppose you'd say. So they really sort of work together, I think, as pieces. I mean, the concert is very much about this idea of the kind of bodily affect and how sound operates on and in the body. So it's about this recognition of the body as an ear, and that's really something I've been developing probably for the last sort of 6 or 7 years in performance. But I think in the last sort of 3 or 4 years, it's really resolved into something that is about that kind of tactility of how the body, exists in sound.
I'm interested because I remember when I spoke to you, did an interview maybe 3 years back when Wilderness of Mirrors was coming out, and you'd been speaking at the time about the fact that you were reflecting on the question of how to present your music in the live environment and the visceral element of listening. Has Cruel Optimism, it sounds like it's been an extension of that line of thinking, but has it led you to reflect on that question, or has it enabled you to kind of expand your understanding of how to wield your material in the live setting to optimize that physical impact?
Yeah, I think when I was working on Wilderness of Mirrors, I'd kind of come out of a period of not performing very much. There was a couple of years there where really I performed as little, like less than 10 times a year for a couple of years, where I really wasn't sure about what the relation is between audience and performer, between sound and space. How is it that we kind of share an experience when a concert takes place? I was really interested in trying to find a meaning there that I didn't necessarily feel was so apparent. So after these couple of years of not quite being sure, I think I wanted to try and find a way to align the possibilities of the studio work and the live thing, and Wilderness of Mirrors definitely was that. I mean, leading into that record, I'd gone to see a number of groups, and I think I was probably a little bit just generally disillusioned with performance. I was very fortunate across my 20s and into my 30s. I saw thousands of bands. Basically, I was doing a lot of music writing and cultural review stuff. And so, every weekend, especially in my early 20s, I'd go and see between 6 and 12 bands in a weekend, and I saw some incredible music. I think back to that time now and think of just how extraordinarily privileged it was to be able to go literally one night after another to see these groups. But at some point, I found it more of a problematic situation, and I think it was probably to do with my sense of how performance was unfolding. And then, as I was about halfway through Wilderness of Mirrors, I went to see My Bloody Valentine, Swans, and Anstundsende Neubauten in this period of 11 days. And a few months before that, I'd been to listen to Earth. And just between those groups, and particularly that period of like Swans and Neubauten and My Bloody Valentine, I really thought, wow, there is this physical capacity of sound to occupy the body that is really powerful and really seductive and sometimes very confronting. And I became very interested in how it was that the work that I was doing could exist in that space. So that's pretty much where I guess Wilderness of Mirrors really started to take shape. Was at that moment where I realized, well, there's this relationship that, sonically I'd been exploring for a while around density and saturation and the kind of abilities of us as listeners when we come in contact with something like music, how it is that we can navigate that experience, and then flipping that into a kind of bodily experience. And I really wanted to find that nexus between the two. And Wilderness of Mirrors was, I guess, the first step into that. And then I think with Cruel Optimism, I think I'd had a lot of those experiences touring Wilderness of Mirrors, and I started to recognize what the elements were that could be deployed. And I wanted to push them further in ways that I guess historically I wouldn't have done with my work. So something like hammering a screw on Cruel Optimism is not the way I would approach sound generally. It's still very much about this question of density, but it was maybe going in a much further, pushing it to the absolute extreme of how much information I can discernibly put into a piece, but then having it very much more about this kind of attack and decay model rather than a sort of sustained assault. So it's been interesting kind of working with that. And the concerts I've done for Cruel Optimism so far have been really, I have to say, completely wonderful. The one in Tbilisi, for example, was incredibly physical. I asked the audience to lie down on the floor, this beautiful garden hall in the town there. And, there's this chance for the body to come in contact with other objects, like in this case the floor, and to sense that vibration, not just within itself, but also like from other objects and from each other, because people, when they're together on a floor, there's this kind of intimacy there. And I also became very conscious of the fact that with performance, there is this really powerful meeting that takes place, that's about a shared experience, that everyone in that room is going to experience the sound differently. And, they're going to have an interior listening to that music that is going to be their own, that reflects their past, their things that have happened to them, but we're all sharing that moment together. So I think there's a kind of interesting idea of community and solidarity that's offered in performance like that, and I'm very interested in that idea. I mean, it's partly coming out of things around. I found the new Judith Butler book around this idea of sort of performativity, like a public assembly and performativity, really interesting, because I think in concert that's something that is there, and if we recognize it and look at it as a kind of sort of political act in a way, there's an opportunity for us to think of how it is that we relate to each other and what those experiences mean in an individuated way in terms of how it is we take in the sound, but also collectively together, that we can be sharing time and space, but still have very individual reactions to that time and space.
I think hearing you talk about this, there seems to be quite a lot of expectation placed upon music and artists making music to accommodate both of the primary environments in which that music is expected to exist, given the vast contrast between listening to music that's been recorded and having that as a personal experience, and then also taking effectively the same material, or at least the kernel of that material, certainly the same process, into a live setting, and as you've described, then making the music become part of something that is entirely different and interacts with the listener in such a different way. It's quite bizarre now I think about it, that we expect this creative thing to perform both functions. And I think the bands that you mention, clearly they have this ability to perceive both as different entities and wield the material across both platforms and to reshape it to be optimal in both circumstances.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting question around control as well. Like when you make a record, you exert a certain amount of control until the point at which that record is sent out into the world. And at that point, you relieve yourself of all control and basically say to people, this is a piece of work that you can encounter in any way that you want. You can put on headphones and listen to it while you do the laundry. You can sit in a black room and put on a loud hi-fi and be completely absorbed in it. Or you can sit on the tube and read a book and be generally distracted and use it as a kind of an audio blockout blind for the sound around you. So I think that's a very interesting thought for how it is that music kind of exists in the world, like as a kind of recorded object. At the other end of that, this idea of like performance, again, is a question of control. And I guess in some respects, the capacity of an artist to work sound it's a really impressive thing to watch. I mean, those groups that I spoke to, and I think it's a kind of slightly different dynamic, those groups are incredible people working together to create sound. There's a kind of gestural physicality to the work that exists on top of the kind of actual sonic materials as well. But I think when you go and experience something like, the last 20 minutes of a My Bloody Valentine concert is an extraordinary experience. I mean, honestly, that was one of the things that I'd never really felt. Whatever it was that I felt, my pant legs blowing in the breeze when there was no wind. That was an extraordinary experience. And it really made me recognize the capacity for sound to really affect us in a bodily way, and obviously in a kind of interior psychological way as well. But that nexus point, I think this is the thing I'm really searching for in concerts, is that nexus point between the appreciation of sound and this synesthetic transformation where sound and touch are kind of bound together, or in some cases it's just touch, and you're unclear about exactly how the sound operates, or the reverse of that. So I think there's this point at which sound listening shifts from the mind to the body, and I think that's a really interesting place to kind of work, because when you take one away from the other, like the concert at the moment has some very kind of dynamic shifts where there's very extreme moments where it's like, well, it almost feels like, can we do this together? When the sound is building up, and then when it finally breaks, the absence of low frequency really makes you recognize, wow, my body was completely immersed in this thing that I wasn't necessarily able to take in, and when it's gone, you really recognize the difference. So it's this kind of process of relief almost that happens, and I mean that almost in a psychological way, but also in a kind of aesthetic compositional way. Being able to put two things against each other and get a different dimension out of the work. So I think, at its best, music really operates at those two levels, particularly in a performative situation. In a kind of studio or home listening, recorded music medium, it's a very different relationship. There's a detail that can exist there that maybe is more difficult to replicate under certain circumstances in a live setting, but that's the kind of beauty of it. You don't want them to be the same. If they are the same, it's boring, completely, utterly, decimatingly boring. And I'm trying to avoid this sensation of boredom. And I mean, that's what's made me so excited recently about rediscovering different kinds of performance work. I mean, that I found it completely invigorating, these three groups during that period. And I've since that time had a number of other experiences with music where in a live setting where you really just realize the capacity for it to speak to us in a way that's really unlike other kinds of communication mediums. That's the beauty of it.
Well, this could probably work as a good segue into talking about one of your picks, because I imagine we'll talk in greater detail about the effect of music on the body and the bodily experience of live performance at least one other point during the selections that you've made. So I'd like to ask you to put forward your first choice as an album that you've picked for this crucial listening selection, and if you wouldn't mind as well just explaining why this is important to you.
I've chosen, the first one I've chosen is Swan's Filth record, and I mean it's an interesting choice, I think, in that, I mean, one, I obviously have a huge admiration for Swans as a group, and as a group of musicians. They, over various periods, they have really created some very powerful emotive work, but also affective work in a way that not a lot of groups have, I think. Particularly in this latest incarnation, I think they've opened up a new way of approaching the capacity of what they can do as a band, as players together, as a group of musicians. It's really quite an extraordinary thing to watch. And I saw them when they were touring the Sia, and the energy that came off the stage, and by that I mean the actual sonic energy that came off the stage and the sort of performative energy that came off the stage, was extraordinarily compelling. It basically made me recognize the capacity of what can happen when people work together, and the tensions that exist in music, and the beauty of those tensions when they resolve and when they don't resolve and they're pulled out over periods of time. It's an incredibly powerful thing to watch. But the reason I chose Filth as a record, partly because I love it as an album. It's incredibly raw and it's full of promise. It's not actually, it's the very earliest seed of what becomes something else. And within that seed, all the DNA is there. You have Michael Jura's voice, and his kind of particular way of using, during that period at least, these very kind of tight phrases, very sort of heavy hitting phrases. And you have someone like Norman Westberg, who just making these completely monstrous guitar sounds it's like blocks of concrete smashing together. That's really how I think about Filth. And they're just smashing together over and over again in these sections, which is, if you think about it in a kind of band structure, it's like literally the drums is one block of concrete, the basses are a block of concrete, and then there's this guitar, and then voice somehow is this hammer trying to smash through these blocks of concrete. It's an extraordinary sense of kind of raw punk energy, unformed, unrestricted, unsure at times. And I found it really interesting talking to Norman. I had the great pleasure to kind of talk to him at length about the process of, basically him joining Swans and the early recordings of those records. And, from talking to him, it's so much clearer now. I can hear them kind of racing to each other during the pieces in the record, because they were not really sure how some of the structures went. It was just like the guitar was high and then it was low, and that was kind of it. And you just made a noise, and then you made that same noise, but it was slightly longer or different, and that's how it kind of grew. And you can hear that in the way that the pieces are recorded, and I love that. Just desire to make something happen, and just to get the pure force of that thing to exist. And I think for me, partly as well, I don't work that way. To the work that I do is about process and about transformation in time. Whereas I get the sense that Filth, particularly, and I think Swans Live is very much about that responsiveness of people together in that moment generating something. Whereas for me, it's many moments that sort of accumulate together that becomes the thing that becomes a record or a piece or whatever the case might be. And I'm always interested in what I guess, we always want what we don't have. I'm always interested in groups that don't operate like that can just manifest these amazing statements within one take or within, half a day in the studio. That just does not happen for me like that. And I feel very strongly that when you listen to Filth, you get that sense of just the rawness of possibility and the rawness of a seed that becomes something else in the future.
Yeah, I think for me, I can vaguely recall first hearing this record, being pretty blown away by. It feels kind of dangerous to me as an album in the sense that I never feel entirely convinced that everything's going to stay in its vague place on the record. During Stay Here, you have that moment where the rhythm switches from like a swing into this 4/4, but it happens, almost feels like by accident, because everything's so loose. It's like something's just, it's like a box on a cargo ship. Something's just tilted and it's slid into a different place. I don't know if you can recall when you would have first heard this record, or where. Is that something that you can bring up? It
would have been in the 90s. There was a period where, I mean, we had a great record store in Brisbane called Rocking Horse. That is still around. But during the 90s, I think for a while there, I was their number one customer. I'm not joking. I think I was the number one customer at the record store. Because basically I was in this very fortunate position after when I was at university and after I'd left school, I was running a fanzine and I started writing for the local street press here. And during that period, CDs still had a currency. You know, they were really a thing. You could get a CD and you could take it to a shop and they would buy it. And often I was doing a lot of reviews of lots of different music, some of it that I was really interested in and other stuff that, you know, quite honestly, I wasn't that interested in. But I was curious to know about it. So, you know, I'd review something and if it didn't work for me, then that's absolutely fine. I can still listen to it critically. I would take those CDs and go to the local another record store that bought secondhand CDs, and I'd go in there with, you know, some weeks we'd get, you know, 40 promos. So I'd take those in and I'd trade them in and I'd get some money, and then I'd go to the other record store and I'd buy, you know, 5 or 6 records with the money that I got for the 40 that I traded in. So I did this, you know, for about 5 years. And during that time, I developed a quite strong relationship with some of the record buyers at the store, who to this day I'm still very friendly with. And they actually recommended Swans to me a couple of times. There was a period where some of the material, I remember when Great Annihilator came out, that was a period where I really reconnected with. I'd listened to some of it before, but something about that record really twisted my interest, and I at that point was very conscious of Swans as this sort of entity. And I guess that was the end of that kind of great period for them. But I combine Body to Body and Job to Job and Filth together as an experience. And actually, to be honest, I like to listen to them in that way, because those early live recordings I think are absolutely phenomenal. I have some great Swans bootlegs from 80, 83, 84, 85. And I really love that period. I would have loved to have gone to hear them live during that time. And because I think partly what's interesting is when you think about it, and I've spoken to a lot of people that went to hear Swans during that period, you know, a lot of people describe this idea of it being very loud. But it's, you know, what's interesting is, you know, obviously Swans is still described as loud, but the loudness now is about this physicality. You know, it's about the kind of heaviness of the sound off the stage into your body. Whereas I imagine that the loudness then was about this high-pitched feedback, noise, mid-band assault. I spoke to a friend of mine who I believe we'll probably talk about in a few minutes, Chris Abrahams, ironically, who saw Swans in the 80s in London. He said it was just like the sound pushed you up against, you wanted to get as far away from it as you could, so you'd sort of stand at the back of the venue trying to kind of escape this assault. And I think that's it was a very interesting description for me, because I said to him, well, what, you know, was it about? And this different kind of frequency. And he was like, yeah, it was very high pitched. There's a lot of feedback and, you know, a lot of energy off the stage out of the amp. So I think it's interesting to kind of contemplate how that shift happened and how people understand loud and noise. You know, I think that's what, for me, Swans were one of the few bands that really kind of addressed that question of like, well, actually, what does that mean when someone says it's loud? You know, what are they really reacting to? And I found that kind of interesting. So when I listen back to those early live recordings that sort of sit alongside Filth, and I kind of get a sense of you know, you can tap into whatever that feeling may have been like. You know, you're never going to know, but you can kind of imagine just from the sort of like ferociousness of how those live recordings are.
On the subject of different iterations of loudness, I feel like at the moment, or, you know, in the most recent incarnation, which is soon to be coming to a close, they almost seem to be working with the loudness of duration as well. I mean, the whole thing is absolutely ginormous across every single axis, and I think there's something about being stranded in that which is so crucial. You know, when you're an hour in and then you've still got an hour ahead of you, and there's an hour behind you. It's like, oh my God.
Well, I think it's sort of like I really do think it's a kind of maximal minimalism, what they do, particularly in those kind of drawn out sections where there's a sort of very heavy repetition of a groove or whatever the case might be. I think they've really learned to maximize the potential of the tension that is set out in that repetition. And I think it can be really, the subtlest change can really pull people with the band, which is, I think, a really powerful thing to recognize, that you can have something that's very similar, but every time there's a little twist, suddenly it pulls people deeper in with you. It's kind of like you're driving down. I mean, it's like Indian classical music, rather than it being about the kind of repeating phrases, it's about going deeper into the sort of cycle of the music. And I think Swans have definitely kind of been able to develop that as a kind of methodology, particularly with this most recent version. I mean, the version of Swans that existed during Filth obviously operated in a totally different way, and it had its charms, and I still, I really enjoy the promise of what that is and what that may have been at the time. But I think now the experience of Swans is probably much richer. I'm sure Michael would agree with that it's a much richer experience than it would have been back in that other time, because of the capacity of all of them to work together. And I think also just the vision of the group, when they got back together, there's always an anticipation that it's, reunions can be really tedious, but this was like a rebirth. And I think that takes a great deal of guts to do that. Because, the legacy, the cultural legacy that surrounds certain projects it's a huge weight. It can be great that people respect it, but actually it's an anchor that can totally just drown you. And very few groups, when they get back together, have that opportunity or make the opportunity to get the work to be something new and alive and vigorous.
Yeah, I'm so delighted to be able to look back on this revival of Swans and see how incredibly it's transcended that legacy that it had to become an entity all of itself. It's quite remarkable. I mean, you, for Cruel Optimism, expanded from what is primarily a solo endeavor, I guess, to work with a number of collaborators, among them being Thor Harris, who plays drums and does percussion in Swans, and also Norman Westberg, the guitarist that we've been discussing as well. I mean, what was it like working with both of those? I understand you went to Thor's house as well to work on his contribution.
Yeah.
How was it working with them?
I mean, they're both incredibly sweet human beings. That ultimately, they're true gentlemen, those guys, and they're incredibly talented musicians in a way that is, this latest version of Swans is the sum of its parts. There's no doubt in my mind. There's no doubt about that. When you listen to what each of those members brings to the band, it's extraordinary. I mean, for me, the reason I approached Thor was he has a sense of melody and harmony that I find completely compelling, and he's so incredibly innately musical in a way that I'm not, I have to say. I'm in awe of how he manages to do what he does. These things flow out of him in such a natural, uncomplicated but considered way. It's extraordinary how he does it, and his ability to perform across instruments and to find, in some cases, often those minimal harmonic information, and yet he was able to bring in this whole other approach that I would not have come to at any point. I mean, that was really, for me, the reason I was interested in collaboration on this record. I mean, partly it was about the fact that for a very long time on my, for quote-unquote solo records, I haven't really been working with many musicians. On Wilderness of Mirrors, I had a couple of players on there, and I found the experience of working with them really good. Vanessa Tomlinson, who played some of the concert bass drum on Wilderness of Mirrors and also plays on Cruel Optimism. She's an incredible musician, And when I worked with her during Wilderness Mirrors, she really opened up a particular way of approaching the material that I would not have got to on my own. And I'm indebted to her, and obviously to all the musicians that have played on the records, particularly Cruel Optimism, just of being able to make me be less comfortable and to know less about where things are going. That's a really great situation. And I mean, there are pieces on the record that are, without the contribution of the other musicians, would be entirely different and not as rich, in my opinion. So something like Negative Drone, that piece is very much, the backbone of that piece is Norman Westberg playing my baritone guitar and creating this incredibly aching flow of kind of guitar droning feedback. It was incredible working with Norman, I have to say, like, in terms of someone that is incredibly generous, very skillful, but also has an amazing working knowledge of how you can make the guitar into this other vicious but beautiful beast. It was incredible to watch him play, because he would just get these sounds out of the guitar that you just think, wow, is that really, what's he doing in there? He did have a couple of very sort of modest pedals, but he just knew how to make the amp and the guitar talk to each other in a way that was so strong and direct and heavy. It was really heavy and beautiful at the same time. It was just extraordinary. So when he recorded this sort of section for Negative Drone, I mean, really at that point, the piece resolved in a way that it had not resolved up until that point. And there were a number of pieces on the record that really took someone to be like, actually, I'm going to go in this direction that you haven't thought about. That made me think, okay, well, maybe there's this other pathway. There are many pathways through the forest, and I'd walk down one where really it might have been a sort of interesting view, but there was nothing really. There was no anxiety. There was no sense of discovery to be had. There was just a beautiful view, and we had to cut down that view and be dragged off somewhere else and suddenly be like, I don't know where I am, but I'm very excited by the things that I'm going to learn. And that was definitely the process for a couple of the pieces. So I'm very fortunate to have recorded with both of those guys. They really brought a language. They brought their language, and they were willing to I guess, let me articulate their voices in the kind of final manifestation of the record.
I'm under the bed. I'm looking the floor. I never scream. This isn't real. This isn't real. This isn't real. This isn't real. This isn't real.
Well, look, it seems like an appropriate point for me to quickly express how much I'm absolutely loving Cruel Optimism. We'd need a second part of this podcast for me to gush to an extent that actually felt like I was saying everything I wanted to say. But just so you know, the record is becoming more and more crucial, I guess, to my... I don't want to say life, that sounds almost hyperbolically grand, but I mean it's become on the edge of my life right now, and I keep coming back to it. We're recording on the day of an election over here in the UK, and it feels particularly pertinent to be listening to a record which feels like it's shaking me by the shoulders and making me consider the world in which I'm existing right now. So thank you for providing me with a listening experience, which, on a day like today is the slap around the face that I need to get on with it and make a decision that I'm going to be happy with.
My pleasure, and yes, we should all be slapped in the face every once in a while. a little bit of a shove once in a while is an important thing, just to wake up. It's very easy to daydream your life away and daydream the world away. And somehow we seem to have a lot of it's, even if it's not daydream, if it's just apathy, whatever it is, that we need to be very present right now, because it's it's always a very complex situation, but somehow right now I think it's never been more bewildering but critical. We're at a real juncture. We're at the death of the 20th century right now, and the birth of the 21st century. This is the year, I think, where we switch. It's never really the date that turns the century over. There's always a period after one century. Like the 20th century erupted kind of on the back of World War One, and I think the 21st century is going to erupt on the back of whatever the hell you call this period now.
Who knows? We should go to your second choice, if you'd like to again introduce this one and talk about why this is important.
Yeah, well, I picked a record by David Toop, Black Chamber, and I picked this record for a number of reasons. It actually has some of my favorite sounds, like just pure sounds on it, that I find myself thinking about or trying to emulate the sensation sometimes in my own work of how they make me feel. David is an incredible musician and curator, writer. He's, as far as I'm concerned, one of the most inspirational figures that I've had the good fortune to come in contact with. I personally owe him a great deal. He was one of the first people that I invited to Australia in the early 2000s and was incredibly supportive of the idea of Room 40 and what Room 40 was doing in terms of reaching out to the rest of the world and trying to get a kind of community interacting between the sort of great southern continent and everywhere else. and he really did encourage me to kind of keep going with it. It was him and a number of other musicians that really were very generous in those early days, where I was, to be completely honest, I was very unsure about what Room 40 was and what it could be. And not just Room 40, but also, in my own work, I really was not sure of the capacity for the work to speak to anyone. And David was incredibly kind, very generous, offered to collaborate together early on, and those experiences were valuable, incredibly valuable for me in terms of building up my capacity, I think, to take the work seriously and to recognize what it can mean to other artists, but also with an audience. So I've always been a huge fan of his work, and this was a record that he made, this Black Chamber record he made during that time where I first got to know him. So I think it was probably one of those records that in a sort of I had a real-time relationship with, whereas, some of his earlier records, all the way back into the 70s, I have a huge admiration for, but Black Chamber has this very particular place in my heart, I guess you could say, for two reasons. One is this piece, Apartment Thunder, Eros Sacrifice. I think that piece, for me, is one of the most haunting, uneasy, but beautiful pieces of music that I've ever heard. In fact, the whole record is it's like you're listening to music in your dreams. David Toop, I think, makes the music that is the soundtrack to the weirdest and most uneasy dreams that I have. In that it's not quite, it's tangible music, but it's still alien, and you don't really know what's next, and you don't want to know, because it's this kind of constant opening out of itself. It's just exquisite in a way that I can't really explain, and I'm constantly amazed by what he does. And the other piece on that record is Black Chamber, the sort of title piece, which has some of the most amazingly beautiful sounding guitar you could ever imagine. Absolutely, just profoundly washes over you with this kind of rich sort of southern sound. It's amazing, and I always I find myself returning to that track over and over. Also, the kind of the nature of the drum in that track and the string parts that I'm pretty sure were actually done by Tom Rochon, who's from Los Angeles, who'd supplied David with these string sounds, and David wasn't really sure what to do with them, and they ended up becoming part of this track. And I think there are a couple of pieces on the record where they happen, and they're so the relationship feels unnatural but so natural at the same time. It's amazing, to listen to music like that where I'm not sure where it comes from, I'm not sure where it's going. I really enjoy that sensation of being unsure of where a record's going to take me, and if I'm allowed to go there, actually, is part of the question as well. Like, can you really go to where the music's taking you? Do you have the permission to be part of it? Particularly something like that Apartment Thunder track. I listen to that, I think, like, really, am I allowed to listen to this? It's a great feeling.
Yeah. I was listening to this last night, and I have to say I haven't heard this record before and haven't really listened to much to David's music. I've read a couple of his books, but the track Raw Mouth Shape came on, which has Terry Day on bamboo reed pipes, and that is the strangest almost duet between his pipes and this clattering sound in the foreground, which I don't know what it is, but they're both responding to each other. And as you say, there seems to be this alien thing where it's like nothing I've heard, but there is definitely a relationship and a communication going on, just one that I can't share in, which is strange.
Yeah, that's a great description of the record. You don't know what these instruments are. Are they instruments? I mean, the electronics themselves to me sound not like electronics sometimes. There's this weird blurring between what is the source material for these sounds, and why is it that when you put 3 or 4 of these elements together, they form this other completely foreign listening experience. David just has, even like David's voice in the record, these kind of like whispered conversations that sort of float around in the piece, I find really uneasy, but completely, strangely for me, quite calming, because I know David. He's a very dear friend. So when I hear his voice, even though there is this kind of sinister whispering going on, I still feel kind of at ease that, oh yeah, I'm in good hands. I'm in very capable hands. So it's a very personal selection, but I think it's one of these records, and David's work generally, I think, he just has such a personal language that he has managed to develop over these decades. I hear his music and I know straight away it is his work. There's something about the way he puts together elements and the space that he leaves between them, this sort of sensitivity to presence and absence that is just completely unlike anything else. I'm sure this is one of those records that I will consistently return to in my life and always draw something different from it, which not all music offers that possibility, but certainly I think David's music generally, it does.
I'd love to now have your third suggestion, Lawrence, your third important album, please, and why it's important.
Which is Ether by the Necks, who I think are, I've said this before, and I'm willing to stand by. I think they're certainly they are the most important band in Australia. There's no question about that. In terms of a relationship between musicians, they're one of the most important bands, I think, in the world, and one of the most original groups that have been making work. And each of them individually are genius musicians in their own right, but when they come together, there is this transcendent quality to how that they play together that is just absolutely magical. In a way that, you know, I would have sat through many hours, probably in excess of 30 hours of the Next Music Live, and I have never once felt anything but being completely engrossed in what they do. They are just an extraordinary machine that is endlessly complex and evolving and getting deeper and richer every single time that they make work together. I mean, I have a huge amount of respect for what it is that they've done. And this particular record, which in some respects is a little bit of I think at the time when it arrived, it was quite unexpected. The records that came before Ether was probably more free in some respects, and there was more active possibly as well. Ether is this very calculated, slow fading away almost, or building up and fading away of these elements, where you just get these sort of eruptions of this very lush sounding harmony and sort of drum cymbal texture working together that then just sort of floats, and then there's a sort of rush of tide of another wave of this sound, and then it sort of floats for a while, and it just keeps going and going. And you know, over the sort of 60-something minutes of the piece, it's just such a rejuvenating experience to listen to it. You know, just the willingness to let elements breathe and to not rush the experience of the music unfolding, I find really powerful. I mean, in terms of you know, what people would call ambient music, I think that's a very big part of what makes ambient music compelling, is when you can be left to exist in the moment as it unfolds, that you don't necessarily have an idea of how time operates in music. For me, the best ambient music has this kind of sense of timelessness, and I don't mean that in a kind of historic reading of sound, more in the way that it unfolds every time you encounter it. That time is bent or curved or non-existent or differently existent, and the Necks do that very well. In a live performance situation, it can be extraordinary. You sit down and they start this process of having the music come from nowhere, and then suddenly they've completed this cycle and 45 minutes has passed, but it feels like you've had 30 seconds with them, or sometimes it feels like you've had 5 hours with them. You know, it can go in either direction, and it's amazing that they can just so naturally play with this sense of time and the space that exists between themselves as players and the kind of possibilities of their instruments.
Yeah, I had a live experience with them just a month back, actually, which was quite strange in that it was at Cheltenham Jazz Festival, which I think attracts people who just generally have an interest in jazz, who had chanced a concert in the town hall, and they had a announcer who came on before they started, who I think saw his role as trying to prepare people for what was about to happen, and people who perhaps weren't primed for, not primed, but maybe hadn't experienced the Necks before. And he wanted to illustrate the fact that they just improvise every time, and I think he was struggling to find the words, but he just said, look, they don't know anything. They don't know anything at all. And everyone laughed, but I think they soon saw what he meant. But there was a point in the gig, and you've obviously seen them, as you say, so many times. So I don't know whether this is something that now happens with all of their live sets or just some, but they reach this almost terminus where everything is billowing and rippling, and the sound is just rolling over itself, and it almost there's a point in Ether, actually, this record you've selected, where you wonder whether it'll ever find an escape from the moment that it's created for itself, where everything is just a cloud. And at that point, a lot of people did start to leave, the concert, because I think that's a kind of, right, you're committed to this or, you're not kind of moment. But yeah, their live performances are incredible. I mean, I think for me, the first sound that they make is always fascinating, because you know that that's going to be the genesis of the next hour of what you're going to listen to,
Yeah, which I just kind of begin to imagine the pressure of that. I guess, that, and it is great. I've seen a couple of shows where really there's this sort of deep breathing out that happens before they start, where it's like they're each waiting for each other to kind of make their first gesture, and this is kind of like showdown thing. Everyone's got their guns out, but no one's shooting yet. And I really like those moments sometimes where I get the sense like everyone's like, well, I'm just going to hold until you go, kind of thing. And I've seen one or two shows where that's really happened. It's been like, is it going to start? Is there a moment? Is there a spark?
Wow.
But then, of course, there is, and then it just erupts. And it's true, like there is something in that sensation where it comes to this point where, how do you solve this problem of the piece? But they always solve it. It's amazing. They're like super sleuths of sound. There is this kind of like amazing moment where somehow they just find a resolution to the most improbable combinations of elements, and it's never the same solution. That's what's so amazing. It's not like they do a show and it's the same every time. It's like every single concert is, even in one night, the two sets are usually radically different to how they begin and frame something and let it kind of, either fade out or erupt or whatever the case is going to be. So, and I've seen them in very different circumstances. I mean, most recently, they were supporting Nick Cave in the Bad Seeds on a kind of, essentially, sort of outdoor stadium tour. And it was quite extraordinary to watch them operate in that kind of environment. And then at the same time, they just actually played in the concert hall here. The night I was flying back from Tbilisi, they played in the sort of main concert hall here. And, the experience there will be very different to some of the other shows I've seen them play in much more sort of modest venues. But they manage to do it. They transcend the space and they kind of pull everything in towards them, which I think is quite extraordinary. It's like you are inside with them in this thing, and the frame is somehow fixed in the next concert. It can be a huge room or a small room, and the experience or the detail or the possibility of the music is still as rich and kind of compelling.
And again, you worked with two of the members for your most recent record, which I could only imagine was incredible. And I know that you've also released Chris's music as well on Room 40 as well. But what was it like to work with both of these people? And I think I've seen you mention that you gave them some pretty, or at least one of them, quite abstract instructions to play with.
Yeah. I mean, Tony's contribution was the second part that was the very genesis of Cruel Optimism. Mats Gustafsson had recorded some saxophone for me very, very early on. In fact, actually, as Wilderness of Mirrors was wrapping up, I did this other session with him. And that was the first piece. And then Tony was the second. And I was interested to see how it was Tony would approach this kind of material. And it was, he was very generous, recorded basically 80 minutes worth of material for me.
Wow.
And within that 80 minutes, there was probably like about 7 or 8 that for me really twisted the early beginnings of Cruel Optimism and made me recognize two things. Sometimes, critically, it made me recognize something that I'm not interested in, which is actually for me one of the most important parts of the record. The things that aren't going to fit are as important or more important than the things that do fit. And there were these parts where I thought, I love the sound of this, but it is not part of what I'm doing. And it's not within the orbit of the greatest sort of scheme. So that was very helpful to have those. And at the other extreme, we had these moments where it was like, these sections here are exactly the kind of textural capacity of percussion and drums that I want to have within the record, and some of the kind of, it's almost like the way he creates white noise with a snare drum is extraordinary. That, and his ability to play the cymbals. I mean, that cymbal playing on ether is just so amazingly reduced, but completely rich at the same time. Like, absolutely, you'd need be nothing else because it's everything, And so having Tony do that was massively helpful in that first kind of period of starting the record out. And Chris, is another one of those people that just has the most incredible sense of harmony. I mean, his solo records, I have a very strong memory of listening to Throne before. At that point, it wasn't a record that was going to be part of Room 40. He just said, I've made this solo album. I was playing at the Nano Festival, and I went over to his house after a gig. And he said, I've made this solo record. Do you want to have a listen to it? I was like, yeah, of course. I'd love to have a listen to it. And we were sitting in his living room, and he kind of had the lights were very dim, and he just put it on. And I remember listening to things like, oh, holy shit, this is the scariest music I've ever heard. And I didn't know where it had come from. It had that same quality a little bit. And I think he does share something actually with David Toop in that regard, that I am uncertain where the music comes from inside him, but just generally, the sound that he got on that Throne record, particularly the kind of positive organ sound that he generated out of that instrument, is just so foreign and uneasy and without reference point, in what you usually consider the real world. It's just so, I don't know, I found it really, really unsettling. And I was, of course, completely obsessed with releasing the album pretty much straight after that. And all of his records, I think that we've, that I've had the pleasure to be part of, share that quality of being unexpected. And I'm always surprised when he sends me music to put out. And honestly, with Cruel Optimism, he was, absolutely critical again in sort of flipping some of the harmonic capacities of the music. I'd sent him, quite poetic instruction for the way that he could approach some of the material, and he, whether or not he paid attention to that or not, he got so much more out of it than I could have ever hoped that he could bring to the table with just some in some cases very simple gestures, and they became the foundation of a sort of density around harmony in some of those pieces that was critical, and sort of shaped a certain capacity of the record, actually. So, I mean, I'm hoping in the future there's a chance for me to work with him and with Tony again, because I think they both have a very particular sense of the way that they approach their work. And I like that it's so distinctly their own. When you listen to Chris's piano playing, his sense of, the way his fingers move across the piano, instantly it is his playing.
Mm.
And it's the same for Tony. He has these very direct, and for a drummer, that's really something, that he has these very direct gestural codes that are constantly in different iterations, but are very, very compelling. I think when you hear them, that there's a sort of intensity to them that is unlike a lot of other drummers, I have to say. He has a language that is very, very much his own, and he's developed so strongly, I think, particularly in the last sort of 10 years, there's been this other layer to the way that he does what he does that is just so quite unbelievable that a human being could hold that sense of multiple senses of time in the same moment.
Yeah. I mean, a good illustration of that is the latest record the Next put out, Unfold, where a lot of his drumming on that album is absolutely insane. I don't know, have you heard that record yet?
Yeah, I have. Yeah, I'm like 100% Next. You could say Next fanboy. I think that's absolutely fine. I have no problem. Every time a new record comes out, the first thing I do is generally order it. And then I'm constantly like hassling Chris, usually because I'm in touch with him quite a bit, and now Tony quite often as well. So I'm always like, so when's the next album coming? They're like, oh, for God's sake, just shut up, just let us do what we're gonna do, and like, come on, guys. So yeah, I mean, I am a huge fan. I think they're an incredibly, I'm very pleased to see that they are particularly in Europe and the UK, getting some proper recognition. Here in Australia, I mean, they're obviously very well respected here, but really they are a national treasure. And the sooner that is enshrined, the better. We have not taken stock of what it is that they have created as much as we should have in this country. I mean, Ether is actually one of the records been accepted into the National Film and Sound Archive collection here, which is, a great thing. But, you talk to people on the street, they don't necessarily know who the Necks are. And, God damn it, they should.
Yeah.
There's, you look at the other groups that we produce from this country, musicians, there are some good ones, but the Necks are in a league of their own. Absolutely, categorically in a league of their own.
You spoke a bit earlier, and in fact throughout this discussion as well, with a conversation about Swans, reaching out to these people to collaborate on Cruel Optimism, and I'm fascinated, particularly as someone who, as you've said yourself, primarily works predominantly solo. What were you driving for when you reached out to these particular musicians? Was it something sonic that you had in mind that you wanted them to approximate or capture, or was it a spirit of a particular person that you thought would make would be a important presence on the record?
I think always when you invite someone, you have something about them, in terms of their capacity as a musician in your mind. Whether or not that's a sound or a kind of sensation that they've given you in the music that they create, I'm not quite sure. It's probably both or one of those things. For me, I admire their capacity as players enormously, and I think I've probably had ideas in my mind about what it was that they could potentially bring to a piece, and specifically I would send people pieces, that it wasn't like here's the whole thing, play on it. It was like, this is a piece, or this is a section of a piece, and I'm interested to know what you could do with that. So clearly there was some kind of thought that there would be a possibility for the languages to kind of come into unison with each other. Or not, that they were going to provide another vocabulary that wasn't there in this phrase. But what almost always happened, whether it was recording live in the studio with Norman and someone like Thor, or whether it was doing it remotely with someone like Chris, or Heinz Riegler as well, another musician that played on the record, incredibly important to a number of the pieces. Their contribution far exceeded my initial thought of what it could be. They unlocked this thing. They opened up the pieces in a way that I just didn't even, I couldn't even see the door. And they found the door, and then they opened it, and that was really amazing for me. And I think, the record, it opened up a sort of sense of possibility that would not have been there had these people not kind of contributed to it. And the thing is, not all of the contributions are used on the record. There's a lot of material that is not part of Cruel Optimism, but the moments where there was this opening out were, that's where the richness is. That's where the dynamics of the record kind of emerged. And obviously there are other moments where it was about this alignment of either stacking in some other kind of harmonic thing to really flesh out a particular sort of phrase or something like that. But more often than not, the contributions really, they were this driving force that, made me reconsider what I thought were fixed positions. And that's really important, particularly during the process of making a record, and particularly for me, with the way that I make a record, as it being a much longer. It's not a kind of live in the studio situation. It's something that takes many, many months, and in fact years in the case of Cruel Optimism, to be made. Musically, it was an incredibly provocative environment that isn't always possible to do in a solo situation. I mean, when I talk about these groups like Swans or the Necks, what I'm impressed by, and in some respects amazed by, is the relationship between the players. You know, that they have this very different languages in a way, but somehow they find meaning between each other. And I guess for me, part of the process of this collaboration was a similar kind of journey. You know, what could we talk to each other about, and what language would we use if we were going to have that conversation? And you know, I might offer some kind of provocation towards something, and then someone else either responds directly to that provocation, or they send me a provocation in return. And more often than not, it was this sort of two-way conversation that took place, even on the remote collaborations. You know, it really was this dialogue that went between us. And I think for me, that's something I've really grown from. You know, and it's good to be able to say that. I mean, I've been doing this quite a while, and I'm still surprised by it. I'm still surprised by what people can bring to a situation, and not even just musically. Sometimes it's socially as well. You know, there is a strong, for me, sensation of community in the way that Cruel Optimism was done. That it's about a chance for people to share not just a kind of interaction as musicians, but as human beings. And it was a great pleasure to have these conversations and to spend time with people, like having Norman come and visit, or going to visit Thor, for example. It was a true pleasure. I mean, I had an incredible barbecue in Texas, the best barbecue of my life, and some great tacos as well, and some great conversation. And I got to pat Thor's dogs and cats. I mean, like, it was really, it was a wonderful, wonderful time, and spent some great time with Connor Walker there as well, who, you know, very kindly lent me his room in Thor's house. So, you know, I'm very, very indebted to those guys, because it contributes much more than just the music itself. You know, those relationships and, you know, I guess you call them friendships, and to the future are really meaningful. And that's actually that's where the important stuff lies, actually, in these relationships between each other. You know, how we support each other, how we help each other grow, how we recognize the importance of what it means to one another. It's critical. You know, that's the value of music is in this kind of exchange, the human exchange that can happen. It's very peculiar to us as a species to have this kind of desire. And I think we take it for granted a lot of the time. I certainly have taken it for granted previously. But I really feel, coming out of Cruel Optimism now, and I guess being able to share the record with people, and to know how it helped me resolve a bunch of the questions and, you know, there's still obviously questions lingering, but like to know that there's a way to decode in some way, shape or form some of the challenging issues that we face, and to have if not a release, then a kind of blanket to kind of cover us a little bit when it is particularly cold and bitter out there. That's, you know, that if that's what the record can do, then that's a really valuable thing. And certainly for me, it offered me a chance to really decode, decompress some of the tension and frustration and anxiety that the current geopolitical environment engenders. And that's, again, also very much to do with where the record comes from, Lauren Ballant's writing around trauma, around affect, around this concept of cruel optimism. You know, I'm as indebted to her as I am to the musicians. I mean, the record is a culmination of all these things coalescing with one another, and me trying to, in some sense, control that, but also let it be controlled by it. You know, this wonderful kind of give and take that goes on when you're making work. So I count myself incredibly fortunate to have had these experiences, and I'm very happy that this year I'm able to share that with people in a concert situation, or whether it be, like you say, private listening to the record, or whether it be in a sort of performance situation. It's a really wonderful thing to be able to share the work.
Speaking of which, I think I read online that you're due to bring this over to Europe in October. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm going to come over at the end of October, hopefully for a week and a bit, and then probably back again in November for some other festivals. I'm actually coming in August as well to do a couple of shows in Poland and Slovenia and Spain. But it's a very quick visit in August. But I'll be spending a little bit longer at the end of October. So hopefully some shows in the UK, but certainly some in Europe. I mean, Semi-Brief Festival is already announced, and I'm very, very happy to be sharing a bill with Gas and Death Prod. Two musicians that I have a very deep affection for, and there's a bunch of other people playing as well that I'm very, very much looking forward to listening to. So yeah, hopefully I can actually catch some other performances while I'm there. That's always the cruelty of touring. You can go to some amazing festivals. I'm actually very happy. I will be coming over to do a festival in Poland in August, and the invitation is from Michael Girard, who I think is curating one of the stages. So
wow.
I'll be very happy to be able to hear Swans in this configuration, because I haven't actually heard the band since I saw them in 2012. So it's been quite a while since I've heard Swans. So I'm very much looking forward to it, because I've been touring the last few times they've been to Australia, and when I've been overseas and they've been overseas, I've been touring in other places that they haven't been. So occasionally these serendipitous moments are very, very good to celebrate.
Absolutely. Well, I hope that is as rewarding as I imagine it will be, and it sounds like another brief trip to Europe is an opportunity for you to flip your body on its head and get a lot of jet lag as well as a souvenir. So
exactly, it's win-win.
And I don't know if there's anything else, Lawrence, you wanted to mention in terms of what you got coming up, which I know is a whole ton of stuff, but I don't know if there's any kind of choice things that you wanted to mention.
I've got two new projects. One is called The Visitors. A few years ago, I was going back and forth with George Romero, actually trying to get him to come to Australia. And unfortunately, he couldn't come in here. I mean, we had him coming, and then he actually got a film project up, which hasn't materialized. I don't know what exactly happened there, but he wasn't able to come down because he started principal shooting on a film project, which I was hoping was another zombie film, but I didn't get any details about that, so I guess it wasn't that. But I was very interested in re-soundtracking Night of the Living Dead, and it's quite a difficult film because of the way it was mixed to kind of extract the audio out, and there's a new version that's just come out that I still think has a mixed audio track. So it wasn't possible to do it, but I have made a piece which takes one very infamous scene of, I guess, the first time that you see the zombies in the film wandering around. Because I think, as a cultural phenomenon, the zombie has come to represent a lot more than just a sort of horrific character. Even if you look at the concept, there's some really interesting writing around the idea of the labor force and the zombie, and the role of the zombie as the kind of inheritor in these narratives that you see in these films. Often there's not many humans left and they're destroying the zombies, but there's this other side to it, which is sort of represents the zombie as the inheritor of the earth, that we have had our moment and now it's time for these other versions of us to take over and potentially not do the kinds of damage that we do to the planet. So there's a lot of interesting writing around this idea of the zombie. So I was very curious about that. So I developed this piece called The Visitors, which extracts that little section, which in the film is about 3 or 4 seconds long, and I've actually made it 50 minutes, slowing it right down. So you have this kind of gentle light play that happens in this very, very heavy, low frequency, minimal kind of landscape of sound that goes on. So I'm actually going to present that next week at the Dark Mofo Festival in Tasmania. And then the other piece that I'm starting to work on is actually, it's called Wayfield. It's going to be a 12-hour performance piece that I'm going to be delivering on a beach overnight from dusk until dawn next year. Actually, it's on exactly the same time as we have the Commonwealth Games here on the Gold Coast, and it's on during the Commonwealth Games. So I'll be doing 12 hours of this very kind of minimal, reductive, tidal sound tides kind of piece on a beach, and people are basically invited to come and sleep overnight inside the sound field on the beach. So that's the next major thing that I need to start working on, because obviously 12 hours of music is quite a lot of music to be generating, but that's the joy and the curiosity of a project like that.
And presumably you'll be working on these new projects from the comfort of your brand new studio, or reasonably new studio beneath your house, right?
Yes. I will be definitely exploiting the wonders of architecture. I've just built a negative space, I think is the name of the studio. And basically, I live in a stilt house, so it's lifted off the ground, and I've built a large kind of sort of bunker underneath it. And it's a fantastic opportunity to sort of set things up. I mean, there's a whole section where we have the label set up, and then there's a kind of recording and mastering section here. So a lot of the work that I do is based out of here, which is very, very luxurious, to be totally honest, to have this much space and to have access to the instruments and have opportunities to record and mix here is just absolutely fantastic. So I'm counting myself very fortunate, I have to confess.
Well, likewise, it's been amazing to have quite a sizable chunk of your precious time, particularly with a 12-hour piece looming on the horizon. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat to me about both your music and the music you love, Lawrence. This has been really nice.
My pleasure, Jack. Thank you.
And to everyone listening, I'll see you next time.